All right. So let's get started with introducing our presenters today. I'm really excited about this presentation. It's my first one back from leave, and I'm happy to be getting started with it. So today's presentation is called Love's Not Colorblind, and we have two presenters here. So I'm going to go ahead and read their bios. So Kevin Patterson is an active member of the Philadelphia polyamory community. In April of 2015, Kevin was inspired to start Poly Role Models, an interview series for people describing their experiences with polyamory. Poly Role Models was part of a drive and a desire to change the way his life and communities are viewed. Kevin has extended the blog's work into writing the book Love's Not Colorblind, Race and Representation in Polyamorous and Other Alternative Communities. And along with co-writer Alana Phelan, Kevin also launched a sci-fi novel series for hire that centers characters of color as well as other marginalized identities. And we also have, presenting with Kevin, Dr. Liz Powell. Dr. Liz Powell believes that great sex can change the world. They are on a mission to help you have more meaningful, pleasurable relationships in life and work, as well as in the bedroom. They're a coach and licensed psychologist helping couples and singles develop self-confidence and authenticity in their relationships, whether conventional or non-traditional. Dr. Liz has made multiple media appearances, including Cosmopolitan, Playboy, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation radio show Ideas. As a sex educator, Dr. Liz has spoken on many stages internationally, including the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists Annual Conference, the Guelph Sexuality Conference, and the Woodhull Sexual Freedom Summit. And beginning in 2020, Kevin and Dr. Liz created the Unfuck Your Polyamory educational series, including lessons for both individual users as well as service providers. Unfuck is designed to help people navigate the world of consensual non-monogamy while avoiding a lot of common mistakes. So let's come off mute if you'd like for a second, and we'll give a round of applause to welcome our presenters for being here. Hello, thanks for being here, Kevin.
Welcome.
Hi.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, we're going to go ahead and let them get started, and let me know if you have any questions. I'm in the chat. You can direct message me or chat me if you have any issues, but let's get started with the presentation.
Yeah, let me start by saying again, thank you for that lovely introduction. My name is Kevin Patterson. People know me for having done Poly Role Models, which was an interview series. And the thing about doing Poly Role Models was it was like pretty common questions. You know, what do you do well? What do you do poorly? Just questions about your polyamory. But the most important question that would come up was, what self-identities are important to you? And how do those self-identities impact your polyamory? So like someone would write in and say, well, you know, I'm Black and polyamorous, or I'm a nudist, or I'm sober, or I'm a mother. At some point, someone wrote in and said, I am bisexual and polyamorous. And so what that means for me is I've got to, navigate around this stigma that bisexual people have, that I'm greedy, or I'm selfish, or I just want to sleep with everybody. And a couple months later, another young woman wrote in and said, I'm bisexual. And I'd leaned directly into that stigma. I am greedy. I do want to sleep with all the people. And so like, identity is something that impacts how we look at the world, how the world perceives us, what we, how we love, how we live. And it's something that like it weighs either for or against us in any number of ways. And that's sort of what we're doing with this, what both Dr. Liz and I have done with our careers, and what we do with this work, and what we're doing here today.
Hi, everybody. I am Dr. Liz Powell. I'm so honored to be here with award-winning author Kevin Patterson. We love to give each other shit. It's one of our favorite things to do, is like give each other shit about like how cool the other person is. It's great. I am a licensed psychologist. I also wrote the book Building Open Relationships, which is like a practical hands-on guide for non-monogamy. And I talk about sex and gender and queerness and kink and all that stuff all over the place. In terms of my personal identities, I am a white person. I'm gender queer, trans masc, transgender, like who knows, all the labels, right? Labels so complicated and messy. I'm bisexual / queer. I am a kinky switch. I am disabled. I'm a veteran. there's a lot of different aspects of who I am that come into how I get to move through both professional communities as a therapist and also personal communities in my own polyamorous dating life. Before we dive in too much, I think both Kevin and I would love to know what it is that y'all would like to get from this class. There are like so many things that we could talk about in here and like so many directions we could take it. And we basically like looked at the class description that y'all were given and like came up with an outline based on that. But we want to make sure that we're answering the stuff that's important to you. So if you want to pop it in the chat, let us know, like, what is it that you want to get out of this? Are there specific questions you want answered? Are there specific topics you want us to cover? Like, how can we make sure that this class feels like it's worthwhile for you?
Absolutely.
I'm gonna give you all a couple minutes to just pop some stuff in if you want to. I'll talk a little while y'all are popping in questions. I think one of the things that Kevin and I both talk about a lot is that when we think about non-monogamy and when we think about professionals who want to work with non-monogamous communities, there are so many aspects of ourselves and of our clients that when we think about diversity, I think it's sometimes hard to like really clarify what it is we mean by that. You know, diversity has become a word that is very broad and vague. And I think when I think about talking about diversity in polyamory and diversity in how clinicians can work with diverse communities, I think sometimes that we focus on certain aspects of what diversity can mean and forget other aspects.
Facts.
The same problems that show up in larger community, in larger culture, are going to be replicated in each of our individual subcultures. They're also going to be replicated in our therapeutic relationships. And so I think a lot of what we want to talk about today goes beyond just like, how do we get more diversity and be better about it, but also about how do we continually recognize how social location is playing out in the relationships we have, interpersonally, professionally. How are we noticing and paying attention to how the different aspects of our culture are bleeding into these sub-communities and these smaller relationships?
Yeah, I mean, there's no gatekeeper at the door when it comes to like the kind of power dynamics, the kind of systemic oppression, the kind of privilege that just permeates society in general. There's no way to keep that out of any of these communities, but there are ways to sort of spot it and make adjustments for it. And if you don't, you lose people. You lose people, and more than just people, you lose perspective. You lose values. So like what we can do is sort of help. And one of the people who responded here said, more interested in making sure my events are more inclusive to BIPOC and LGBTQIA plus folks. And yeah, that's something we're gonna speak on without a doubt, because I know what it's like to feel unwelcome in a space, and I know what it's like to have people put in an effort to make you feel welcome in a space, and I know what it's like to have put in the work myself to help people feel welcome in a space. So yeah, we're 100% going to speak on that.
Yeah, and I think too we're going to talk a lot about intersectionality and non-monogamy, and also intersectionality and therapeutic relationships. I think a lot of us in our training as therapists, one of my biggest beef with therapist training is the myth of the blank slate, that like so many of us are given this idea that our goal as a therapist should be to be as neutral as possible, have as little disclosure about who we are as possible. And that sort of an idea is only possible for people at the top of a privilege hierarchy. When I walk into a room, people are going to know things about my identity, whether I want them to or not. the more trans that I become visibly, the more they're going to know about it, right? The way that I speak, the way that I move, if I'm having a bad pain day, they're going to notice, right? And so I think that there are ways that what I hope we can help talk about here is also about, as therapists, care providers, organizers, whatever it is that we're doing, how do we continually be aware of the stories we have taught about who and how we're supposed to be, and unpack the ways that those ideas also come from this like cis het white patriarchy that tells us about what it is to be good and right and professional and all of those different things.
Yeah, there's a difference between like, you know, being able to spot someone's identity and using that as information along with a whole. And there's a difference between that and like seeing someone's identity and using it as a complete definition. I know in my lifetime there have been times where someone has seen me as a cisgender, tall, handsome Black man, and made all of the and made like all of the judgments that they felt necessary to judge a situation, and that's not how that works, you know. So part of what we do, part of what our work is being able to help people to, if you're going to spot an identity, using it maybe using it to inform an interaction, but not using it to define an interaction.
Yeah. So Kevin and I are both big on stories as a way to anchor the things that we teach and talk about. And so I thought that we could open this presentation with some stories of things that we have experienced, both as people in polyamory communities and as people getting therapy as polyamorous folks. I know Kevin has a great receiving polyamory therapy story, but I will start. So I moved to Philly last year and have just recently started actually participating in like the Philly scenes because COVID numbers have been low enough that it's felt relatively safe. And it has been a fascinating thing to start interacting with the Philly kink and non-monogamy scenes here, because I moved from Portland, Oregon, and before that, the San Francisco Bay Area. And those are places where it's regular to ask people pronouns, to listen to the pronouns they give, and then use those pronouns. And in Philly, apparently that is less common. So it has been fascinating moving through this community as a genderqueer person. And like the last kink event I went to, I wore a pronoun pin and still got misgendered. And it's like a big honking pronoun pin. It's not easy to miss. And so part of my experience in polyamory circles has been what it is to be a genderqueer person and how many people need me to be a woman in order for them to see me and recognize me and interact with me, and how uncomfortable they become when I insist on being not a woman. In addition, I'm disabled. I have chronic pain, I have migraines, I have ADHD, and I love our communities. They tend to, however, be very limited in what they consider to be accessibility needs. Most accessibility needs tend to be, can you get a wheelchair in? With little regard to what other things are required for accessibility for people with different access needs. As like a person who does education as an ADHDer, you know, Kevin and I were teaching our Unfuck Your Polyamory course, and we got feedback from someone that what they think would make our class more accessible for people with autism is to have very detailed outlines of every class, including every story we're going to tell, and to provide that to everybody before the class. As an ADHDer, I would never teach a class if that was the requirement in order to teach a class, because that's not how my brain works. Like, I just can't do that. And something we may end up talking about as we talk about like diversity and access to spaces and who are we centering is that sometimes there's what's called access friction, which is that the needs of different groups rub up against each other in a way where they may not be the same, right? What I need in order to teach a class as an ADHDer may make it very difficult for someone with certain variations of autism to be able to participate in that class. I'm not wrong, they're not wrong. It just may be something where it's difficult to find something that is accessible and welcoming to both of us. And I think a framework to be mindful of as we talk about diversity in scenes and diversity in our practices and how we as clinicians and leaders participate in these communities is like, whose needs are we centering? How are we centering them? And are we doing it in a way that is purposeful or a way that is just following with what seems right?
Yeah, like I was at a party recently, or not recently. I was at a party. The pandemic is a bit of a time machine, because in my head, like, recently is, oh yeah, a few months ago, when really it was a few months before the pandemic, which started years ago. But I was at a play party, and the host had music going, because the host has a particularly noisy brain and needs music to sort of keep it even. And there were other people who were at the party who were like, having this music is overstimulating for me. And the music wasn't loud, but their experience was that music was overstimulating, whereas other people, including the host, needed that music in order to get over their own situation. And as Dr. Liz said, like, nobody's wrong there. People are having two different experiences, and then you have to figure out, how you can manage. So Dr. Liz lives actually in Philadelphia proper. I live just outside the city. And when I joined the community, like, I had been reading all of the books, listening to all of the podcasts. As far as I was concerned, discovering non-monogamy, which I'm a 20-year grizzled veteran of non-monogamy. As far as I was concerned, it was a cheat code. And I wasn't going to lose that. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't making as many rookie mistakes as I could. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't making mistakes in ways that could damage people's hearts or my own ability to maintain ethical, consensual non-monogamy. And so eventually that led to me finding the local community. And I get to the community, and Philadelphia is anywhere between like 40 to 45% Black, depending on which census data you look at. I would go to community events, and I'd be the only Black guy there. I'd go there, and it would just be like me. Sometimes it would be like 2 or 3 Black folks, and they all came in my car. Sometimes it would just be me and this one other black dude named Kevin. Like another guy who went to I went to Howard. He went to like another HBCU, but we'd be like keeping an eye out because we wanted somebody else there that looked like us in these events. And like the very first time I went to an event, I got microaggressed upon within about 5 minutes there. And it took a lot of the wind out of my sails, because I was excited to go to this thing. It was the community's first event in a long time. This is, I think, 2015. It was the first event in a long time, so it was a big deal that everyone go. I get there. It looked like the entirety of my OkCupid stream was in one place. So I was excited to finally like meet people in person, establish some connections. And I'm like 5-10 minutes into the event when somebody says something to me that took the wind right out of my sails. And like something I remember very definitely about that event was that there were 7 people of color there. I shouldn't be able to count, but you can. It shouldn't take just a glance around the room, but there were 7. And of those 7 people, 3 were me, my wife, and a guy my wife was seeing, and of the 4 remaining, two of those people never came. 2 of those people never came back to community events, as far as I know. The other 2 only started coming back when I became part of the local leadership years later, and I started hosting events. And I said years later. So that means there were years where those folks didn't have community, didn't have resources, didn't have events to go to. And like just having that as a loss, when you're trying to find your way is devastating. It's shattering.
Kev, do you want to tell your therapist story?
I see what you wrote there. That's actually not my therapist story.
That's not your therapist story? Whose therapist story is that?
Yeah, a friend of mine was going to my co-author Alana Phelan on my superhero books, the For Hire novels. She went to get couples therapy, her and her husband, and they chose somebody specifically because they said, I am polyamory informed, I'm polyamory friendly. And once they get to the couples therapy, the therapist looks around and says, like, okay, well, will your third be joining us? And they didn't have a third. They weren't in a triad. They dated separately. The problem that they were having wasn't related to their polyamory. The polyamory was sort of tangential to the problem that they were having. But this person, immediately thought of thirds because same situation. They didn't use polyamory to inform their take on the interaction. They use it to define that, and it was a mistake on polyamory in as well. And that's something we run into as well. Like, my wife and I went to couples therapy back, wow, it's like a decade. Well, no, more than a decade ago. This is before I was a father. My wife and I went to couples therapy. I can't even remember when. And the very first thing the doctor said was, okay, well, since you two are having trouble, why don't you just break up with everyone you're seeing and focus on each other? And focusing on each other and working on our problems, that's good advice. Breaking up with everyone we're seeing, like losing whatever support we have, that's terrible advice. And he didn't think that, he didn't know that, but that's why we're here. That's why we talk about this stuff.
Yeah. And so, I think one thing we wanted to talk about is kind of like the popular conceptions of what polyamory is. Because I think when you look at a lot of news stories about polyamory, they use the standard stock image of like 3 pairs of feet that are white feet, and they're a man's feet and 2 women's feet in a bed with their like very white sheets, right? Like that is the polyamory stock image that we've all seen 300 versions of.
Yep.
And I think that there is this popular conception that like polyamory is like white people stuff. Polyamory is cis people stuff. Polyamory is stuff that is relatively heteronormative because like the dudes have to be straight. You can't ever let penises touch. That's like gross gay stuff. You don't do that. But like women having sex with each other is fine because like dudes are into it. And like we all know that women aren't sexual subjects or actors. Women just like receive sex. So like if they're just receiving at each other, it doesn't even count, right?
Yeah. I mean, and there was an episode of Insecure. And Insecure is a good show. If you got HBO Max and you find yourself with some free time, I love that show. The way they light Black people on that show is phenomenal. It's the best lighting I've ever seen on Black skin in my life. But season 2 or 3, there was a non-monogamy storyline. And like the very first question that comes up, where one of the main characters starts dating a guy who is married. And they're like, oh, well, they have an arrangement, so it's okay that I'm dating this guy. And the very first question that comes up is, isn't that white people shit? And I was in the middle of writing a chapter of the book called White People Shit while I was watching that episode. Like I shouted out Issa Rae, the lead writer and star of Insecure, on Twitter, because I was like, hey, you're kind of leaning into my work here. And that's sort of a representational problem, where if the only time you ever see, if you never see yourself reflected in a thing, in representation of that thing, in advertising or so on, it's very easy to just write yourself out of it as if it doesn't belong to you, as if it can't belong to you. Something I mentioned in the book Love's Not Colorblind is, so many of us didn't see ourselves reflected on cartoons. So we just assigned Blackness to characters that had a little bass in their voice, whether that be Papa Smurf or, Optimus Prime and Transformers, or the Thundercat Panthro. We just sort of assigned Blackness to these characters. And you can't really do that in terms of like a real thing, like if I turn on TV and I never see Black people skydiving or mountain climbing, I just assume that's not a thing Black people do. And and then you become sort of the weirdo of the bunch when you decide to do that anyway. You become a minority inside of a minority.
And, similarly, if we look at depictions of polyamory or how people think about polyamory, you don't see a lot of people who are disabled. There's not a lot of talk about disabled folks having sex of any kind, but especially not that disabled folks might be horny and slutty like everybody else and want to have a bunch of partners. Like, that's not, disabled people are burdens, not partners. So obviously they couldn't do polyamory. When we think about people who are trans and non-binary, there's a lot of ways in which certain aspects of non-monogamy communities can be very unwelcoming to them. The swinger community, for instance, tends to be very unwelcoming to anyone who is significantly outside of a fairly cisgender heteronormative mode. And I think that the way that this also plays into the way that we as clinicians see relationships is a lot of times we end up in spaces where if we haven't taken time to unpack our own internalized ideas about things like mononormativity, it's very easy to start playing into those ideas in how we talk to our clients and how we reinforce things. So Kev, like, what is mononormativity?
Just the societal enforced idea that like monogamy is a default as a default setting, and that anything outside of that is abnormal or ready to be pruned, destroyed. If you've ever seen any representation of non-monogamy on television, a lot of times it's portrayed usually one of two ways. It's the sexually adventurous woman who her sexual adventurousness is also paired with like alcoholism, out of control drug use, and then eventually she finds Mr. Right, which is essentially Mr. Correct Dick, who solves her problems, breaks her out of her self-destructive pattern and into what's it called? Into a life of heterosexuality and compulsory monogamy. And the other way it's portrayed is the hall pass. The hall pass, in that like somebody gives their partner permission to do, to sleep with one person with some set of stipulations, and it always ends up destroying the relationship or leading to the ultimate moral of the story, which is monogamy. Monogamy is the moral of the story, and it's a society about monogamy being the moral of everyone's story. You, me, everybody.
And I think mononormativity also comes into the ways that we think about which relationships should be valued, particularly when we have to make difficult decisions about allocating the actually scarce resources of things like time or money. That mononormativity, and particularly, US Western mononormativity, is that like your romantic sexual partner is the top of your world. And so they get all the resources first, and then you can turn to other family or friends and allocate your resources there. And if you're doing multiple relationships, that's fine, but obviously one of them is the real one. And so that's the one that you would hold on to or value if everything else is going wrong. I think that mononormativity is also a really important factor in the ways that we think about how relationships get structured within non-monogamy. That when we think about like prescriptive hierarchies, a lot of what prescriptive hierarchy does is maintain mononormativity as much as possible while allowing for outside relationships. The way that I define hierarchy is a system wherein there is a purposeful constructed power imbalance between relationships at different levels of the hierarchy. So people at one level of the hierarchy get a say in relationships below them that the relationships below do not get in return. So it's basically a question of like, who gets a seat at the table, right? Huh?
Yeah. Veto power.
Veto, yeah.
And there's
classic example, but there's other smaller examples. Yeah.
There's so I published a story recently. It wasn't my story, but it was a story that I published on my blog. And young woman starts dating a couple, and the couple has all sorts of rules. Now, this young woman, the letter writer, she didn't have a hand in creating any of those rules. She was expected to adhere to all of them without having any actual input. it all blows up one night when they're getting ready to have a movie night. And the young woman and the husband of the couple that she's dating, they order a pizza. The game plan is to stay in, eat pizza, watch movies, have some sexy times. And wife comes home, opens up the pizza box, and sees that it's pepperoni and black olives. Apparently, that's a special pie for her and her husband. And she loses her shit entirely when she realizes, you bought our pie for the three of us. Closes the box, throws the pizza, and gets and triggers a fight that ends with the letter writer snatching up her stuff, leaving, and never coming back. And these are the kind of things that we see as normalized in monogamous settings. The irrational anger, quick to violence. These are things that, I've seen t-shirts that say, stay away from my man or I'll cut you, or something similar. And these are things that we get sort of a normalized idea of. And when we find ourselves in non-monogamous spaces, a lot of us carry that with us, and it's hard to unseat, it's hard to unlearn. But we carry that with us, and we reinforce these same kind of hierarchies in that way.
And I think too that, when you are a therapist or a organizer or whatever working with non-monogamous folks, it's very easy to take the assumptions of mainstream culture and try to figure out how to do it, but with more people, right? That if in a regular relationship, it's totally normal for someone to be able to say, like, no, you have to spend Friday nights with me, that would make sense in this non-monogamous structure. Part of what I think of when I think about non-monogamy and like expanding out our ideas of what it is to do therapy and what it is to do relating is about finding out ways that we can promote autonomy and healthy interdependence rather than this very like control and coercion focused model that a lot of mainstream relationship culture creates for us. And if we look in the therapeutic relationship, there are ways in which a lot of models of therapy reinforce this idea of the therapist is the expert, the client is coming in to learn, the therapist knows best, the client is supposed to listen, right? Rather than creating a model of empowering choice and letting our clients tell us what is right for them. If I have someone coming in to see me who really wants a strict hierarchy in their relationship, it is not my job to tell them that that's the wrong choice. I can help them explore what that means and why they want it. If they ask, I can tell them why I see that tend to not work super well a lot of times. But like, our job as clinicians is also to work at unpacking these hierarchies that we're taught through this culture of who is in charge, who knows things, who is right, who gets agency and autonomy, and who does not. I think something else when we're talking about diversity and what gets in the way of the diversity in different communities or in our clientele or in the ways that we move through the world is that dominant structure is very much set up to reinforce a lot of different kinds of stereotypes about who does what, who wants what, and what it means. If we think about working with clients and you have a couple come in to see you and they have a discrepancy in desire, the assumption most people would make is that if it's a relatively, like if it's a cis man and a cis woman, probably the man wants more sex than the woman. And what we're going to do is figure out how to either get the woman to want more sex or get the man to stop wanting sex. This idea that men want, women go along is based in the patriarchal idea of women as objects and recipients rather than active participants or people who have their own desires and wants. Similarly, when we look at our communities, if something goes down, if there's a problem or a conflict, the ways that the structures are set up can strongly inform to us who the villain or the bad guy or the problem is. Things that I've heard people talk about a lot, if we're talking about abuse in relationships, I know that we all love the book, Why Does He Do That, right? Like, it's a great book in a lot of ways. And it kind of says that mainly abusers are men and like women can't really abuse men for reasons. I don't know that that's super true if we look at the complexities of intersectional power. In communities, if there's conflict, particularly if there's conflict about a majority white space run by majority white folks, and there are BIPOC folks who are challenging that, a lot of times it's the people talking about that that are considered the problem, rather than the existing white structure being the problem.
That's actually my experience entirely. Like the way I got into doing this line of work, into this sort of educator slash activist space, was because of talking about my experiences being Black in the Philadelphia area community, and as a result, I burned as many bridges as I built just as a result of that. A lot of times, like I mentioned earlier, that I had been part of local leadership. I was local leadership of a group founded by a guy who said out loud, "I will never let that asshole be a part of local leadership." He actually doesn't know that I know that he said that. It eventually got back to me. It was while I was in a leadership position, because I brought it up. I pointed out, like, hey, here's the leadership structure. Here are the people who are the organizers. Here is the lack of diversity in this space. This is what the demographics look like. And because it was me bringing it up, I was looked at as a malcontent, as opposed to when other white folks brought it up. When white folks brought it up, it was like, oh yeah, this is a problem. We should work on this problem. There is a Facebook group that I love bringing up called White Nonsense Roundup, and like the purpose of this group, White Nonsense Roundup, is to get into arguments about race in place of people of color. So like every time that I've, it would be, me arguing with somebody about, about one, about some topic, some racially divisive topic, and I would tag them into the conversation. And every single time that I tagged this group, White Nonsense Roundup, a white person would show up with lightning speed and say, "Hi, my name is Susan from White Nonsense Roundup." And then they would say essentially the same shit that I was saying. And every single time, the white person that I was arguing with would say, "Wow, I never saw it that way. Thank you so much for, thank you so much for explaining this to me." And it's like, well, you could have listened to the other guy who was already saying that, but it's a way that sort of social capital works. And when you're a minority in these spaces, you don't always have that. Backtracking to something Dr. Liz said about how we see abusers as men. I am a very talkative person. I am very, like my whole career in these spaces is me just talking about myself. Something I almost never talk about in any measure of detail is that I was in an abusive relationship a few years ago. I was manipulated and gaslighted all the shit. It had me completely backwards in ways that I did not understand. Until years later did I not understand it. It was years later, and several conversations with people who understood the topic better than me had me understand exactly what I had been going through. And I never speak about it in detail because I am a tall Black man, and the person who was manipulating me is a smaller white woman. And as a result, I don't look like I'm on the wrong end of a Law and Order SVU episode. And there have been times where I've brought it up with friends only for them to be like, "But are you sure you didn't deserve that?" In so many words, not exactly those words, but like, "Are you sure you didn't trigger this on your own?" Because like, how could I be someone who was on the wrong end of abuse when I am styled the way that I am? And just knowing that has kept me out of spaces where I could explain like my own circumstances and like have my own opinion about my own experiences. I mostly just keep it to myself or talk to Liz.
Yeah, we talk about it. And I think when we talk about like, how do we build diverse communities? How do we encourage diverse communities? How do we encourage, diverse clientele in an inclusive environment? What we're getting at here is that all of us in this culture are fed a variety of stories about who is like what kind of people do different kind of things, about what it means to be something, about what kinds of people look like, what a person looks like who does X, Y, or Z. And it is really easy to continue moving through the world without unpacking that until we face something that forces us to actually unpack that and take a look at it in more depth. I think that most of us here, because you're in this class, probably recognize that in general, more diverse communities are better for everybody. And at the same time, diversity doesn't just happen we have to actually choose to create it, that we have to make purposeful choices about what we do. Something that happened a few years ago, I got contacted by someone who was doing a big like summit on non-monogamy, and they had contacted me to see if I wanted to speak at their summit. And I emailed them back. I was like, hey, this sounds super interesting. Can I ask you, like, how many BIPOC presenters do you have for this summit? And they replied and they were like, oh, we have a lot of diversity in terms of things like gender and sexuality. So it's a very diverse summit. And I was like, cool. But like, do you have Black people that are part of this? And they made a comment about like they had a certain number and that was fine. And I decided to not participate in this conference or in this summit because part of my job as a white person is to ask those questions and tell people that they need to do it different.
If I remember right, didn't you suggest to them some Black people and they said like, we've got enough Black people or something to that effect?
Yes.
Like,
yes.
So like they were
and like this went down while we were all at a conference weekend together. So like Kevin was getting like real-time updates about what was going down, which was kind of fun, but also kind of horrifying to see what this person would say to me, another white person, that they would never have emailed to Kevin ever in a million years.
Yeah, and part of the problem being in these spaces is that like me being a Black guy, a lot of times people feel like me being Black is the only thing I have to offer a space, you know? And like, yeah, I speak about race and polyamory, but also I speak about parenting and polyamory. I speak about masculinity and polyamory. I speak about polyamory just in general because I feel like I've got some pretty decent ideas about polyamory. And I keep an eye out for how often I'm brought in or asked to speak about race versus these other things, you know? Like these other things that I also have like the same level of expertise, the same level of ability to speak on. And so the idea that like qualified speakers were being turned away because like there were enough people of color, no one ever said, no one says that the other way around. No one says like, oh well, we've got, there's 20 speakers, we've got 10 white folks, that's enough white folks. No one ever really says that sort of thing. So the idea that there was like a quota for people of color versus other folks, that was shocking. And and that was something that I ended up backing out of as well, and several other people backed out of as a result.
Yeah. And when we again talk about like the choices we make to help create and support diverse communities, those of us as white folks are used to taking up a lot of space. We're used to being at the front, we're used to being the ones coming up with ideas and being the leaders. And a lot of what creating diverse communities can look like is white people taking a step back and moving out of those positions to create space for people who are less represented. Now, this gets complicated as we talk about like full intersectionality, right? Like having a fully cis het leadership team that is all BIPOC is not necessarily as good as a team that has people with a variety of gender identities, people who are disabled, people who are fat, people who are, all of these different marginalized characteristics. But especially in non-monogamy communities, we tend to do fairly decently most of the time with like queer folks, trans and non-binary folks. We're messy about disabled folks, but it's better or worse in different areas. But across the board, it tends to be actually pretty bad about BIPOC folks, except in communities started by folks who are Black or other Indigenous or people of color. And so a lot of our job as white folks is to take a look and say, oh, this is already a lot of white people, I don't need to be in this position. Or to say, hey, it looks like our entire leadership team is white. We need to actually change that. So how about we figure out how to change that?
The something Dr. Liz said earlier is that we said something to the effect of we all know that diverse communities are better. And I want to stop there for a moment, like just as the reason why, because it's not just like I want to make sure that that's said out loud. The reason why is because when you have diversity of people, like you have diversity of ideas, you have diversity of thought. There are so many times where I feel like I've got enough answers. And then I realized that I didn't even know what the questions were because I spoke to somebody whose priorities were different, whose identity was different, whose experience was different. So like we need to have more people in the room for that sort of thing where like I've got some good ideas, but like I'm not disabled, I'm not trans, I'm a cis guy. There are going to be times where I don't know what questions to ask. There are going to be times where questions are asked that I don't know the answers to. So just having a different set of people is useful. There's an event that I love that's happening, I think, in a couple of weeks, and I'm really disappointed that I can't go there. Southwest Love Fest in Tucson, Arizona. I went there the first couple of years, and I loved being there. They had childcare, which is something you don't always see at these kind of events. But part of the leadership team were single parents, and they said, like, I want to go to this event that I'm creating, but my kid is, but I need childcare. So they set up childcare for this event. I've got a really great system with how I parent with my wife. There are so few times where we require childcare just because if she's going to a thing, I'm home with the kids. If I'm going to a thing, she's home with the kids. There's so few times where I consider it because we have our own system. But they needed something in place, and they had something in place. And every time I heard somebody outside of like these educator communities discussing Southwest Love Fest, they brought up how glad they were to have a place to put their young kid, while they learned about, polyamory 101 or something that I was teaching or something Dr. Liz was teaching or something like that. Just having people in the room will give you perspectives on what you should or shouldn't be doing.
And having that diverse group also helps you when you're looking to identify barriers for entry and dismantling them.
Yes.
The thing about childcare, I don't have kids, so I would never think to have childcare at a conference, but that is a very real barrier for entry to people who have kids and need a place to put them for a weekend. Things like the physical space. When we're talking about accessibility of a physical space, 30% of people have fragrance allergies. Did you know that most hotels have what's called ambient fragrance or scent marketing, which means that there is perfume pumped through the air ducts all of the time. So 30% of the population can't go to events held at hotels unless they're willing to take the ambient fragrance out of their system, which even then probably won't work super well. When we look at the physical space, wheelchair accessibility is one thing, but also do we have like a low sensory space for people who get sensory overwhelmed? Do we have interpreters for people who need ASL or for people who need other versions of interpretation? Like, how are we handling all of the accessibility needs within this physical space? When we look at locations that things happen, locations for your therapy offices too, is it close to public transportation or do people need a car to get there? If they need a car, that's creating an additional barrier for entry. Cost. I moved to Philly and I went to my first kink event here, and it was a $60 ticket. And I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area for years, and the most expensive event I went to there was like $35 or $40. So I was shocked that in Philly, a significantly less economically stable community, the prices were so much higher than they were in San Francisco. Cost creates huge barriers to entry for folks. And I think as therapists, we all have to figure out our systems of managing cost, because the people who most need affirming services are the least likely to have resources to pay for it.
I hosted a party at my home. It was just just a local poly potluck, and an educator and writer that I knew was showing up with their spouse and their kid. And the second they get to my door, I realized that something was wrong. Like I could tell that they were off. Like I don't know what I didn't know what their situation was, but I could tell that like they were frazzled. And apparently like their kid had a meltdown in the car, and the kid's meltdown triggered the spouse's meltdown. And then the writer friend of mine who is prone to anxiety attacks, like was triggered by the spouse and the kid. And I gave him a spot in my basement. I gave him a spot in my basement. I was like, look, just hang out down here. We could turn the lights down low. Let me fix you a plate. Let me put your clothes in the washing machine, because part of that kid meltdown was a spill or a vomit or something. I don't remember what, but like, we took care of them for a good half an hour to an hour after they arrived. And then they ended up having a great time. And every time I see them, or every time I see them like talking about like, events and stuff on like on Twitter or social media, they mentioned that. That wasn't something I planned. This is just my house. This is just what my house looks like. If this had happened at a like a local area venue, if this had happened at a bar, or or anything like that, they would have been SOL. Like, when they showed up to my house, they were ready to leave. They were just gonna stop, use the bathroom, get right back in the car and go home. And so now, like, that's a question that I have to ask. Somebody mentioned that they want like ideas on what to do, like how to work on inclusivity. There are so many questions you have to ask yourself, and sometimes you don't know them all. And that's why you should you should work on your leadership. But like, if you're having an event, what part of town is that? What part of town is that? Is that a place that's accessible by mass transit? Is it a place that that has a cover charge? Is it a place that has like Dr. Liz said, like a quiet area? Is it is there going to be cigarette smoke? Is there going to be alcohol? Are people required to drink alcohol? Is there like a 2-drink minimum or something like that? You have to ask these kinds of questions. You have to ask, like, is this a part of the town where Black people find themselves? Is this a part of the town that's so affluent that people that's so affluent that people can't show up? Is this on a weeknight where people are going to require what's it called, childcare? These are all things that go into your planning. And I understand, I really do, I understand the desire to just want to get people to a space. I understand the desire to just want to have something where you can say, I'm having a potluck, and have 30-40 people show up to a potluck. But there's more than that. And if everyone at your potluck is looking the same, or coming from the same socioeconomic background, or feeling, or like, there are going to be people who feel unwelcome as a result of these choices that you're not making.
And as clinicians, when we're working with clients, especially clients who are like newly exploring communities, if our recommendations are like, oh, you should go to this event, you should go to this group, you should join this thing, and we aren't considering how these different barriers to entry might show up for them, particularly if they aren't ones that show up for us, it can be really easy to set the people that we're working with up for failure, right? If I'm working with a client who is Black, and I recommend that they go to this party that's out in the Jersey suburbs in a richy rich neighborhood, they're probably going to feel a very different degree of comfort going to that event than I am, because yes, I am very visibly queer, but like, you would be shocked how good rich people are at pretending that I'm not. So they'll let me walk around their block, but a Black person in cape gear walking on their block, they may have a lot more of an issue with that. And I wouldn't necessarily know that or have experienced that if I'm not being very on top of like how that may show up. In addition, I think, when we as therapists are working with our clients, I think that one of the ways these barriers to entry, or these like difficulties around identities and like structures of power and oppression, can show up is in how and whether we address them directly, right? I think that most of us are not taught in our training about how to bring up intersectionality issues with our clients, about how to address the power imbalances that are in this relationship that we are creating. And similarly, I think that a lot of us, even in our personal lives, are not particularly used to proactively bringing up the different power imbalances that are present and what it means and what it looks like. I myself recently, for some reason, all the people who want to date me recently are significantly younger than me. I don't know what it is. I mean, I look a lot younger than I am. I don't know. Maybe they all have a daddy fetish and I'm like the daddy of their dreams. Who knows? But they're all young. And so we have a lot of conversations about what that age difference means, about what it means for us to be dating, about how that looks, about the concerns I have about dating somebody younger, about the ways that they can let me know if I'm doing something to capitalize on that power that I have by being an older person with more experience in these things. Similarly, as a therapist, when I'm working with someone and I know that there is something about our identities that creates a power imbalance, I try very hard to like very explicitly name it and open it up as a topic of conversation. I talk to my clients about, hey, so, I'm a therapist, but I'm definitely not perfect. So when I mess up, please tell me. Like it's not an if I will mess up, it's a when, because I'm a human too. And so like let me know. If I say something that doesn't stick right for you, if I do something that upsets you, like please tell me. Let's talk about it. Because I think that when there are these power imbalances, the person in a lower position of power is going to be reluctant to bring them up and talk about them if the conversation hasn't already been opened.
Yeah.
And if we're expecting them to bring it up, it creates a huge burden on them to not only be experiencing this disempowerment, but also to call attention to it and hope that you don't react negatively.
The year or so that I spent in local leadership, like I made it a point to not start dating any new people as a result of that, because like I was really scared of the idea that like if I had a falling out with somebody, and like I'm a pretty chill person, like I don't like the whole villainizing people and breakups and making lording power over people. I'm not into any of that stuff. But even if I feel that way, I can't know that they don't feel that way. So when I was in leadership, I made it a point to not date anybody new, because I didn't want to potentially, have someone feel ostracized because they didn't get along with me. I ultimately ended up dating one new person over the course of the year that I was in leadership, and like it was something that sparked up sort of spontaneously, but we had to have those conversations. I was like, look, I see where this is going. I'm enjoying it too, but also because I have this position in this group, and like, yeah, she laughed in my face when I brought it up, and I was like, okay, feel free to laugh in my face, but we still have to have the conversation. Even if it's a joke to you, even if it's a joke to me, because like I don't really care that much about like volunteer power in these kinds of spaces. Even if it's a joke to both of us, we still have to make sure we're on the same page here in case something goes wrong. Thankfully nothing went wrong, and 4 years later we're still together. But like if we didn't have that conversation, who knows?
And I think too that like part of this opening conversations thing, part of my informed consent conversation with every client I see in our first session is like, hey, so if we end up in the same place at a sex party together, how do we want to handle that? Right? Like, how are we going to deal with that? Because I am someone who goes to sex parties. I'm someone who fucks at sex parties and does kink scenes at sex parties. I have been at sex parties that my clients were at. And so it is a conversation we have that if you are a person who does these things and we're in the same area, we may run into each other. How do we want to handle it? Right? Because it is way better to have that conversation as part of our first session and to know that that's a thing we can come back to than to end up at the sex party with my client there and both of us kind of being like, right, like, oh no, right. And it gives me an opportunity to say to them, like, look, my policy is like, let's just stay in separate areas. I'll try to stay away from you. You should try to stay away from me. You can come up and say hi if you want, but other than that, like, let's keep it moving. Like, just give each other some space, right? And it has, for some clients, given them a really good opportunity to talk about the awkwardness of how small our communities are. If you are a therapist, if you are a spiritual leader who is a part of the communities that you are also working with, it is like living in a very small town. When you're in a small town, everyone knows your business, even if you don't want them to. And it can feel very strangling. Like it can feel very, very small. I was a psychologist in the military for 5 years. And the fascinating thing about being a psychologist in the military is you get really used to small town psych. My last assignment was as the brigade psychologist for an aviation brigade. So I was the therapist for all 3,000 of the people in that brigade. Plus, they were also the people who were giving me my fitness test and watching me pee for my urinalysis and providing my medical care and doing my ratings. And I was doing some of their ratings, right? And so it's this complicated mess of different relationships that intersect. If you are a queer and or trans polyamorous person who is kinky, the likelihood that you are going to be able to see people who are a part of that community and not be in community with them anywhere outside of New York or San Francisco, basically zero. So a big part of creating these conversations and talking about these power dynamics is also about talking about how we navigate shared spaces, how we navigate these small worlds that we find ourselves in, how we can talk about things that are happening within these worlds that are impacting our clients that may also be impacting us. And it is hard. It is hard because, you know, I think a lot of us as therapists feel very uncomfortable with our clients knowing about us, especially knowing about like our sex lives and who we're dating. But I'm a polyamorous person, and everyone that I'm dating has to let the people they start dating know who they're with. Because if they start dating one of my clients, what the fuck do we do then? I mean, it's messy. There's the ethics code that we are handed doesn't tell us how to deal with this. And I think that when we talk about this, when we talk about diversity, when we talk about creating inclusive communities, it is important to recognize and realize that for those of us in therapeutic frameworks, this all gets very messy very quickly. And it is helpful for us to do the front work so that we're not panicking after it gets messy.
Speaking to how small these communities are, at the start of the pandemic, my wife and I had a rough patch, and a lot of us had rough patches during the pandemic. So, you know, it be that way. So we decided to look for couples therapy just to make sure we could stay properly on the same page. And I was able to find someone that my wife and I did not know at all. And we, you know, thankfully we were able to iron out our problems, and we've been pretty fantastic ever since. Eventually that therapist showed up on my Facebook under, you know, people you may know. And I decided, like, all right, you know, let me click and look at this profile. This was somebody, again, that I said, my wife and I did not know. As it turns out, our therapist went to got their doctorate from the same place that I got my master's, and my wife got her doctorate. And we had dozens of mutual friends. You know, this was just someone I did not know, but who knew dozens of people that I know. These communities are minuscule and smaller still if you decide to be a part of one while you're working in a therapeutic capacity.
And so when we talk about like, what can we as clinicians or organizers or leaders do to promote an inclusive environment? We've already talked about like the proactive work of making sure that there is diverse leadership. If you're a solo person in private practice, you really can't diversify your practice because like you're one person, and I can't make myself other diversities. Like it's just not, I could trans myself harder, I guess. I don't know. But I think that one of the most important things that we've kind of talked around a little bit, but that I want to really make sure we nail down, is that assumptions aren't your friend. When we are talking with clients, when we are talking with community members about what is going on for them, it is very easy for all of us to play into assumptions that we have, because as humans, our brains are lazy and they want to take shortcuts, right? Like they don't want to do a lot of work if they don't have to. And so when we are talking to someone, just in general as a human, we're going to fill in what we think they mean and assume that that is the case, unless we like make a purposeful effort to slow ourselves down and ask more questions. And so what I think is important is to remember that when we are working with clients, especially clients who are of minority groups within whatever minority group they're a part of, right? Because like polyamorous folks, we're already a minority group. Within polyamorous folks, there are minority groups, right? Asking people like, what does it mean to you to be in this? Like you say that you have a primary partner. What does that mean to you? What does that look like? How do you want things to look ideally? A lot of people, especially of more oppressed groups within these communities, may feel like they have to just kind of accept what's been handed to them. And one of the most powerful things we can often do as a clinician is give them the space to imagine something better. Like, imagine if Kev showed up to that first hangout for poly folks that had 2 Black folks there, and he was like, well, that's what it is, right? And was never given a space or encouraged to think about what it might look differently, like what might be a better thing for them. Similarly with our clients, especially if we're working with polyamorous clients or people who are newly to non-monogamy or exploring things, I think so many people make decisions based from their fear and what they're worried will happen or what they think they're supposed to do, and don't think about what they really want in an ideal world. If you're showing up to these kink events and they're being shitty to trans and non-binary people, how do you want it to look different? Like, what would that look like? If I'm hosting a group for people who are non-monogamous and all I'm getting is white folks, how do I want it to look different? What can I do to help create that? Are the people in this group also in alignment with that goal? Because if not, it's going to be hard to bring in other people to that group. If I try to bring BIPOC folks into a majority white therapy group and they're just going to get a whole ton of microaggressions, I'm not doing anyone in there any favors, right? I don't need to put someone through that experience. So I think that there is so much here about, like, how do we want things to look? What do things mean to us that is important to explore?
How do you make space for newer people? How do you make space for people who, like, I mentioned my experience at my very first event. This was me there trying to make a first impression on people I didn't know. This was me trying to find my way in a group of folks who were who were generally pretty familiar with one another already. Like, even though this was the first event in a long time, this had been the first event in a long time. These are people who had been on Facebook groups with one another for, weeks, months, years. This was my day one. If I had said all the things at that event that I had wanted to say, maybe I wouldn't be invited back to that space. Just having an idea of, and also those folks who never returned, those folks who never came back to these events. When I became part of leadership, I spoke to them. There were people who came back when I started hosting, but there are people who never came back, and I reached out to them and I just said, like, hey, we were at that event together. I was just wondering why you never came back. That's not always a question people ask. When I was first finding my way in these spaces, I would always sort of gravitate to the other people who looked like me when they'd show up on their first day. When I started becoming more of a welcome and known commodity in those spaces, another Black guy show up to an event, I'd make sure I talked to that guy when there was an opportunity, just like on some, hey, how's it going? How long you been? How long you been here? What's your day look like? And if those folks never came back, if I had a means to communicate with them, I'd ask them about that. Whereas some people never really felt that was their responsibility in tending a space. And I feel like if you're tending a space, that is your responsibility. Find out what makes the space welcoming or unwelcoming. Even if that's information you don't like to hear, this is information that you need. It's information that you need if you want to change that space. An educator that I love, David Wraith out of St. Louis, he gave me the line, like, if your event looks like a Klan meeting, there's other work to be done. You might want to, there are questions that you have to ask. There's work that needs to be done. What are you going to do about it? If you're not being purposefully inclusive, then you are being passively exclusionary. And if that's not what you want, to be known for, you've got to do that kind of work, because these spaces are so small that it's very easy to get these kinds of reputations. The local community here, the polyamory community, when I joined it, it had a reputation for being unwelcoming to people of color, unwelcoming to, like, queer and trans folks, and a reputation for harboring abusers. I learned that our local community had a reputation for harboring abusers from someone who lived in the Pacific Northwest.
I knew it had a reputation for harboring abusers in 2015 at Atlanta Poly Weekend.
Exactly. Like, if you, the Eve Rickert, the co-author of More Than Two, who was living in like Vancouver or like just somewhere in the Pacific Northwest at the time, had a whole long explanation about my community 3,000 miles away. And this was before I was really a known commodity in my community. That's how small these circles are. You know, it can be Game of Thrones where everybody's sort of interconnected, intermarried, these noble houses of our respective cities. And if that's not what you want, you have to start asking these kinds of questions. You have to start being really proactive when it comes to that sort of thing. Um, I see you getting ready to talk. Give me 1 second.
Go.
As a result of those reputations, because of those reputations that our local community had, when I started being loud about it and a few other people started being loud about it, we were actually able to force an election. Um, the folks who started our local community here, they weren't bad people. They weren't bad people. They just didn't have a skill set for the kind of leadership that the community required. They weren't even building a community, honestly. It was something to the effect of they didn't like the polyamory groups that they had been to previous. They decided to go on OkCupid, host a potluck, and just invite everybody that had polyamory in their profile. And they ended up getting like 24 people to their house to help host a potluck. And afterwards, someone made the suggestion, let's turn this into a Facebook group. So in case we want to do this again, we have an easy way to contact folks. It started with those 24 people. It's something like 1,500 people now, last time I checked, and now it's over the course of just a few years. So once it got big enough, they needed people who could sort of steer the ship, and that just wasn't the skill set that those folks had. And that's how we ended up with the reputation that we got. So we were able to force an election, and when we did that, we said we can't have 4 white people as part of this leadership. We need to make sure that there are other people involved. We can't have all men as part of as this leadership. We need to make sure that if we have a leadership team that at least 3 of those people can't be men, you know? And as a result, we started seeing such a turnaround in the community, both the people that we welcome into our spaces, but also how welcome previously unwelcome people started feeling. You can't see it now because it's about here. You can't see it now because my background's all blurry. But I was featured. My wife and I were featured on the cover of the Philadelphia Daily News. I think like late 2017 or so. It's on there. It's a newspaper. The date's there. But we got featured, and as a result, we brought in over the course of the next couple of months like 300 or 400 new people into our local community. And most of those people, because I was part of leadership, I was able to see like who we were intaking. Most of those folks were people of color. I used to be able to crack a joke that like, oh well, I'm speaking in Los Angeles this weekend, so if Philadelphia has an event, it's all white because I'm in Los Angeles. I used to be able to make that joke pretty confidently. Now, like I haven't been to a community event in pandemic notwithstanding, like a couple of years. But when those events happen, there are lots of Black folks there. There are lots of people of color there. I don't have to be part of leadership anymore because we changed leadership and changed the landscape of the group. And at this point, I forgot where I was going with it, but yeah.
Cool. I can jump in. So like, as clinicians, I think too, that when we talk about like, part of what this goes to is like, what is the culture that you are showing is to be expected when you encounter a space or encounter a group. And so as a clinician, if you're listed on Psychology Today, do you explicitly talk about things related to social justice and racial justice and intersectionality? On your website, do you talk about your identities and how that plays out in your work? Like, are you explicitly acknowledging these things? Because that will let people know that you're at least aware of what's going on there. Additionally, if you are someone who is on social media or who is like recommending other sources, are you recommending all books by white folks? Are you reading all books by white folks? What theorists and academics and scholars are you looking to for guidance about how to do this work? Are you diversifying your own intake of information? And if you have like a resources list on your website, what's the breakdown of the folks who wrote those resources? have you taken a look at it and actually thought about it, right? When we think about how word of mouth works in these communities, I tend to get a lot of people who reach out to join my practice, who want to be my clients, who are minorities or of oppressed groups in a variety of ways, because my website, my work, my profiles, everything is very explicit about like looking at societal structures of power and oppression and how that plays into the experiences of people and the things that they feel like they're able to access or who they're supposed to be. And as a result, even though I am a white person, I get a lot more people of color who want to come see my practice because they know that at the very least I'm open to that conversation. And I also try to make sure that as often as I can, I promote resources to help, Black, Indigenous, and people of color find therapists who are similar to them and who can share in their experience. They don't need to educate, that they don't need to worry about performing microaggressions in the therapy room. Like, are you providing these resources for folks to show that at the very least you understand what is going on here? If you are platforming people of a variety of backgrounds, if you are helping folks, if you are providing low-cost services to people from more oppressed backgrounds, word will get around about that quickly.
Yeah.
And if you're not, that word gets around quickly too, right? Within these communities, it is a small town and people will talk about having had bad experiences with therapists. It's pretty common for folks to go to their friends and say like, hey, I'm looking for a therapist. Who would you recommend? And those threads often have almost as many comments about like, don't go to this person, they did this, as they do about like, go to this person, they're great, right? I think that for a lot of us, it is easy to accidentally wander into a space where we are just putting together lists of white resources, we are just reinforcing this white supremacist framework because we've never been forced to examine it, and we've never actually had it pointed out to us that that is what is happening and what we're doing. And so this is another way in which we can work very actively to make sure that we are increasing the diversity in what we're talking about, who we're taking in, where we're learning. Okay, so list of resources. Really great resource is WACSHN, the Women of Color Sexual Health Network. So it is a group of women of color who do a variety of sex education, sex therapy, variety of like sexual health type services. And they have people in every different state. They are people who are speakers, educators, therapists, everything you can think of. WACSHN is fantastic. Kevin's book, of course, is a really great one. Kev, what else would you recommend? I mean, Sunny and Ken's podcast is great.
I'm gonna write that into the chat there.
So Sunny, Megatron, and Ken Melvoin-Berg, they do the American Sex podcast that talks about a variety of different things. Also, Dr. Jess of Sex with Dr. Jess. She is half Chinese, but someone who is often read as a white woman and talks a lot about that experience of being in a often a swinger community and being read as a white woman, but not really identifying with that.
Dirty Lola is a fantastic follow on Twitter, and I think it's just at Dirty Lola 69 on Twitter. And Dirty Lola keeps a Rolodex of sexual health professionals. She's an incredible resource, and she's featured very heavily on the new Netflix series called Principles of Pleasure. She's literally the very first person you see when you watch it on Netflix, and it's a really quality show.
Lola's great. In terms of other non-monogamy folks, of course, Zach Budd, who is the Consent King, talks a lot about consent frameworks. Very good stuff there. Evita has Evita changed last names?
I'm gonna find Evita's page and put the link in there, because I know that there's some word things that happened there.
Also, Ruby Bowie Johnson runs Poly Dallas Millennium. Last year, I believe, it was all BIPOC speakers. So really great conference about non-monogamy and sexuality that centers BIPOC voices. Also, Sex Down South, which is run by Marla Renee Stewart, also centers BIPOC voices. So there's a lot, so many resources out there. What else in terms of trying to think other resources? We'll keep looking into it. If we think of others after the class, we'll just shoot it over to the folks running it so that they can send it out to all y'all. But there are a lot of things out there, and especially like I'm fairly active on Twitter. I do a lot of following and sharing of people who are different from me in a variety of different ways to make sure that I'm being aware of what I'm missing and also uplifting other voices that may not get as much traction as I do.
Yeah, and I do the same. I'm at Poly Role Models on Twitter, and I do the same. And that's I'm gonna type in the name there, Zach Bud.
Oh, I got it, Kev.
Oh
yeah.
Oh.
Well, we both did it. Yeah.
Good job.
Another thing that we can do as clinicians is really do the continual and unending work of unpacking our own baggage. It is impossible in this culture to grow up without internalizing white supremacy, homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, classism, ableism, fat phobia. You know, we are surrounded by it all the time.
Yeah.
As a result, it is impossible to not have some of that internalized, at least to some extent. And it is our job to continually work at unpacking that and identifying how that is showing up for us in our interpersonal relationships, in our therapy relationships, in what we talk about, who we read, whose voices matter to us.
Yeah, I a couple of years back, I started identifying as queer, and part of the decision-making process of that was I told somebody, like, I don't know if I want to, I don't know if I want to inhabit queer spaces because I don't know that I feel queer enough to inhabit queer spaces. I don't want to take up space and bring some cis hetero energy, regardless of how I'm identifying. And someone sat me down and told me, I don't feel queer enough is the queerest possible thing you can say, because apparently that's a thing that comes up.
I may have been one of the people who said that to you, because that's...
Yeah, no, I wouldn't be surprised. And just the idea that level of internalized queer phobia was baked into the queer experience requires like a lot of thought, a lot of introspection, and a lot of unlearning as you sort of find your way in your journey.
And this also involves mononormativity, right? The scripts that we have about relationships, the scripts that we have about who gets to matter, how they get to matter, how we're supposed to show up, what we owe to our partners. That is something we also have to continually work at unpacking and examining. We are taught a structure that is very much based in control and coercion because of things like capitalism and white supremacy and colonialism. We have to do the work of unpacking those and figuring out what relationships could look like outside of these extractionary models.
Yeah. Where are we on the
I think we can talk about I think we're going to clinicians support diversity, and we've talked about the first couple a little bit, so probably the last one.
Yeah, so there are and I'm gonna jump around a little bit on our outline. Something that ends up being useful are intentional groups, affinity groups. One of the chief examples of that is Black and Poly. It's a group started by Ron Young in, I think, 2013, 2014. And it was basically Ron Young making the decision that he wanted to have a polyamory space that looked like him, that represented him. And so we started this group. Now, Black and Poly is branched out. There's a there's like a chapter of this group in several major cities. When I was part of local leadership, I would coordinate with the leadership of Black and Poly. And next thing you know, we've got double the attendees to events. And like if I hosted something for Philadelphia, which was the major group in our city, we might get a few Black folks. If I coordinate with Black and Poly, we might get dozens of Black folks, people who won't show up to Philadelphia events. But at the same time, we also get double the resources, double the advertising, and double the coverage. So just being able to reach out to those kinds of groups, people who again are going to have answers to questions you might not have thought to ask, or or be able to ask questions that you didn't know to ask, and so on. That changes your landscape, and you can also do that in terms of networking with BIPOC clinicians and community leaders to develop your own referral base.
Yeah, the thing is that, when we talk about this, especially when it comes to issues around like race, I think that as white folks, it is very tempting sometimes to just say like, I don't even know who I would talk to, but like they exist, the people exist, right? I think when we are worried about how we are encouraging diversity within our practices or supporting diversity in our communities, one of the best things we can do is reach out to folks and develop relationships with them and talk about what they need. Going to a lot of conferences and events and like making friends with people from different areas and talking to them about what they ran into in dealing with therapists around non-monogamy. So much of what came up for a lot of folks, especially for BIPOC folks, was that almost all of the non-monogamy therapists were white, and that felt really uncomfortable to them. It felt very strange. They didn't know if they would be comfortable there. And the thing is, there are clinicians who aren't white who work with these communities, but they don't tend to be promoted as often. They don't tend to be as well connected to other folks. And so I think finding ways to really actively promote exchange and connection and networking with people who aren't like us can serve a lot of different functions. Like, number one, it can really increase your referral base in terms of who you can refer out people to. I think that, if we're being honest, we all know that we're not the right clinician for a lot of folks who come through our practice. Sometimes we make that easier for us to say to ourselves, to say like, maybe I should refer this person. And sometimes we make it harder. And I think, especially if you're a white person, it is important for you to know who are the people in your area who you could refer clients to if they don't want to see a white therapist, because it may be much harder for them to find that than it is for you to figure out those connections and help provide that to folks. There are so many more folks these days who are not white therapists who are working within these areas, who are working with sexuality. Programs like Widener have done a really good job of helping to increase the number of people trained in working with sexuality and relationships. And there are groups that help make sure that BIPOC folks are able to access training. When we're talking about like the process of becoming a therapist, it is so freaking expensive and it takes so much time and you do so much work for nothing. And when we when we look at how we can help diversify the field, I think that we need to all look to like, what are the groups or the communities or the individuals who are working to put together access to therapy for people who are not white. When we talk about fees, somebody brought up like insurance and fees. One of the things that I think is tough to do as a clinician is figure out how to pay your bills and give access to therapy to people who can't afford therapy, because insurance is a terrible, terrible thing when it comes to mental health coverage. And my experience of trying to get on insurance panels is that it was nearly impossible. When I lived in San Francisco, I contacted a few different insurance companies about getting on their panels. None of them would take new providers. So when we are looking at how we can increase access and support diversity, see if you can find groups who are supporting the training of BIPOC folks. Maybe you start like a mutual aid support fund so that white therapists who are having a good month chip in money to help support BIPOC clinicians who need to be able to take more folks on their caseload from people who can't necessarily afford to pay as much. The way that I do my own fee structuring is that I have a very high full fee so that clients, because I still have a bunch of clients from California who are in tech, work for companies like Google, right? I have a very high full fee that they pay so that I can charge very low fees to people who need them and make it accessible to folks who don't have income and who don't have insurance that would cover this for them. Are we thinking about creative ways to make these things financially accessible and to help support the training and all of the money that goes into that process so that we can have more clinicians who look like the clients that need service?
Yeah, even the classes that Dr. Liz and I teach professionally, like the Unfuck Your Polyamory courses, like we make sure that that's on a sliding scale. It's a pay what you can model where we offer up, you know, what we think the classes are worth, but also if that's not something you can cover, then you can come in, you know, far under that number. But we just want to make sure that the resource that we're creating is accessible to as many people as possible, especially people who might be marginalized by way of class. I talk about that a lot, where the average Black household, it makes $23,000 a year less than the average white household here in America. And like $23,000 is a lot of money. That's a car, that's a down payment on a house, you know, that's any number of conferences, events, potlucks, movie nights. That's something that's an amount that can change your entire landscape.
Similarly for trans folks don't make much money. Disabled folks, people who are on disability, are required to stay in poverty. Like the laws around how much money you can have and how much money you can make if you're on disability is horrifically poverty level, right? And I think, you know, we offer our classes as pay what you can. If you as a clinician can't offer like half of the spots on your caseload to be very low fee, what can you offer? Like, how can you support people in a variety of ways? Can you run a group that's a pay what you can group? So it's like 2 hours of your week and you might make like $50 from it, but it's something that everybody can access even if they don't have money, right? How can you find creative ways to support people who have these different access needs?
There was I don't remember the exact numbers, but the stimulus package that went out during during the earlier days of the pandemic. Somebody broke it down where the amount that got put into the stimulus package, if you broke it down and gave it to each American taxpayer, it would have been something like $28,000 a person. If you put $28,000 into the hands of every American taxpayer, we don't have a pandemic anymore. We don't have people going out and working when they don't need to. Going out and working when they don't need to. People, you know, struggling to get by. $28,000 a person. That's more than that's almost double minimum wage. Just having that as sort of a frame of reference for the kind of people who are going to be who you're going to be working with, and understanding that that's the level of imbalance that you're working with, like that could do wonders for anybody.
And, you know, other things for access, I've offered video chat as a therapy option since I started my private practice in 2014, in part because I travel a lot to like teach at conferences or do other things. And so I wanted to be able to continue to work while I was out of town, but also because, you know, my first private practice was in Savannah, but there were people in other parts of Georgia who really needed a polyamorous therapist and couldn't drive all the way to Savannah every week to see me. Access issues geographically become compounded in areas that are further out from major metropolitan areas. So, like, what are you doing about video chat for clients? If someone needs to do a phone call, are you able to do that? Like, how do you handle these complex issues around access? Is your office something that is not accessible in some ways? And like, what can you do to increase that accessibility? Are you someone who, like, how are you available to your clients for them to communicate with you? What feels good for you? You know, there's a lot of things that when we're talking about expanding mental health access for these communities that are experiencing oppression, that may not have financial resources, that may not have people who look like them that they can go to, there are a lot of different ways we can do this. And I think the more that we can, as groups and individually, creatively problem solve this, the better we're going to be able to do to serve people who need it. If we stop at, well, I as a clinician can't afford to take on any more low-fee clients, that's not necessarily going to be as helpful as if, hey, what if I as a clinician work with this local community to set up like a mutual aid fund that helps pay people to go to therapy. So like it gives them money to go to therapy every week. What if I, as a clinician, help set up a mutual aid network for polyamory people in the area, so that like if polyam folks are struggling with their bills, they can just send in an application form and get money from this mutual aid fund, and people who have it can send it out, right? There are so many things we can do about access that go beyond the things that we tend to most think about. And I think looking to communities that are like anarchist communities, sex worker communities that have had to figure out ways around main structures can give us a lot of more creative ideas about how access can be changed.
And like having conversations about these kinds of things, having conversations about the kind of privileges you may hold, it's so affirming. It's so affirming to have somebody bring this up without you having to bring it up. It's so affirming to have somebody see it and acknowledge it. Where a lot of like if I run into if I'm getting professional help from somebody and it's a white person, I don't know whether or not this is a Trump voter who doesn't see my humanity. You know, I don't know that or not, and that's something I've got to be mindful of. That's math that I have to do in my head about how safe I feel or how safe I feel in this situation. So that's a conversation that you as a clinician bring up, and a conversation that you allow to be brought up. I might feel more seen. I might feel safer, more willing to open up, just because I don't think this person is judging me in a way that I am commonly judged by society. You know, so just having that can be really affirming. It can be really changing.
So I do want to notice time. We've got like 17 minutes left.
Yes.
Do we want to do like final closing words and then open it up for questions?
I was gonna say I don't know what my final closing words would be, but I was gonna open,
Cool.
but I'm good. I'm good with questions.
Yeah, we can definitely open up for questions. If y'all have any questions that you'd like us to answer, any comments.
Also, I don't mind if people bring it up by voice if they don't want to bring it up
That's fine too.
by putting it in the chat.
Yeah, either's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a question about like safeguard ability to be inclusive of poly clients while dealing with insurance. I am not in network in any insurance. So insurance usually gets real sketchy about covering couples therapy stuff. The way that I deal with that is I have my very significant sliding scale, right? So like I'm not taking anyone's insurance. If they have out of network coverage, I provide them a super bill, but that's the extent to which I engage with insurance. So I may not be like the best person to answer that question. I don't know if other folks have more experience around that. I think that like you might be able to get away with calling it family therapy because technically it kind of is. I am also, the caveat I'll give here is like, my opinion very much is one of like, these systems are bullshit and set up to center the oppressive viewpoints. So I'm kind of okay with fucking around with where their margins are and like playing within them enough that I don't get like kicked out of them, but also bending the rules enough that I can help people get the help they need. So like if you can call it family therapy, that'll be fine.
I don't understand how I'm going to go ahead and say I don't know how insurance works especially not in a clinical setting. I've got a chiropractor though. I've got a chiropractor where if you show up with cash, he will cut your bill and he will high five you for bringing in cash. I don't know what games he is playing with insurance. I know that he is avoiding insurance and taking cash in hand. If that's something you can get away with, go for it. The people it's a rule, but it's not your client's rule. You know, it's a rule, but it's not something that they might feel they need to adhere to. It's something that helps. And if that's where you want to be, then go for it.
It's a rule, and who is it serving, right? Like,
yeah.
Who are we actually serving through this, and who are we harming? Like, if you call it family therapy, and that gets the insurance to pay for it, like, who's actually being harmed here?
Yeah, exactly. Karen Washington, just want to say I really enjoyed Love's Not Colorblind. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's we just passed the 4-year anniversary of Love's Not Colorblind a couple of weeks ago, and um I'm glad people are still enjoying it. I'm glad people have found value in it or in any of the work that I've done. Thank you. Yeah, holding the space and sharing your experiences. Follow you on Twitter. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm blowing up on Twitter a little bit right now because I did a very short thread about Pride, because the Pride discourse started even earlier this year, and I was like, hey, guess who gets to be at Pride? Kinky people, naked people. This is great. Let's do it. Guess who doesn't get to be at Pride? TERFs, SWERFs, cops. There we go.
Yeah. All right. Right. Practice.
Yeah,
Most
we got a
students.
CPT code. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sure,
Any other
absolutely.
questions y'all have?
Hey, I'm oh sorry.
Oh, geez, you first.
I just wanted to say, because it was taking me too long to type it out in the chat, that I just really appreciate the conversation and hearing other professionals who are polyamorous like discuss clinical issues that would come up in therapy sessions that like are not going to be taught in, you know, monogamous traditional therapy spaces. So I just wanted to say that, yeah, it's just like a huge relief to hear those conversations being had.
Yeah. When I started doing this work, I was sort of shocked at like I would go to sex ed conferences and find myself being the only person talking about non-monogamy, and I'd find myself going to non-monogamy conferences and find myself as the only person speaking about race. It was amazing to me because I figured these were conversations that were already happening, and I was adding my voice to them. And in a lot of spaces, I ended up being the guy. And like just keeping these going and like being able to angle them in as far as race, as far as disability, gender, you know, and like being able to talk to like mental health professionals and such, just expanding that conversation as far as it'll go. I'm glad we're doing it, and I'm glad Dr. Liz is doing this with us.
And like, it's fascinating to me because, you know, I went to the ASECT conference this one year. I was expecting ASECT, this is sex therapists. Everybody's going to be cool about stuff like non-monogamy. Ooh, was I wrong? They were not. It was fascinating how even within the sex therapy community, there was still so much weirdness around non-monogamy and weirdness around sex parties and weirdness around kink, and particularly weirdness around clinicians who go to sex parties and do kink in public. Therapy is a very conservative field in a whole lot of ways, and we need to be talking more about how we get to be our full sexual and relational selves as therapists, and that we don't actually have to be like husks of human beings just because we happen to do therapy.
Word.
Antonia, did you want to?
Thank you. I appreciate that. I don't know if anything will come top of mind, but I was curious about if either of y'all had any ideas around like common pitfalls or common mistakes that well-intentioned white folks make around like some of these attempts at diversity and inclusion. I mean, I feel like we've been talking about it the whole time, but specifically that, yeah.
Defensiveness is the first thing that pops into my head, because everyone wants to think of themselves in glowing terms. Everyone wants to be the hero of the story, and no one wants to hear that they've done anything wrong or that they've contributed to someone's discomfort, that they're complicit with any manner of systemic oppression. And that's not how that works. I know that like I've got I'm making an amount of money, and I'm good sharing that around whenever I can. You know, like if we go out and I've got the money, I don't mind covering it. It's not a big deal to me. What happened is a friend of mine told me that I was being classist in some way, in that the way I would invite them out to things that they might not be able to afford, that I was good just covering outright. They told me that there was a classist element to our interactions. If I'd gotten defensive with them, I would have learned nothing. and I might have lost that friend. Whereas in stopping and listening to what they had to say to me about the situation and how they saw it differently than the way I saw it, I learned about what I was doing, how it might be perceived otherwise, and it's changed the way I interact going forward. Where, like, I'm still all good spreading it around when I have it, but that means I have to have further conversations with people about, hey, is this a problem for you? Do we need to discuss this? Do we need to find a different place to be, a place where you can pay your half of the bill without a problem? Just it's something we all do when we're in these positions of power, that we get defensive about things. Because the first thought I had when this person brought it up to me was, I'm not classist, but I would have gained literally nothing. If you go to the interwebs, to your Google box, and type in the words, I don't have a racist bone in my body, you will get an endless amount of results of people who say those exact words. I don't know what's with those exact words.
Why is it always a bone? I don't know. Like, why is it always a bone? Like, wouldn't it be a brain cell? Like, I feel like.
But like, if you put in those exact words, you will get like a list of horrific racial aggressions, followed by people saying those words, meaning they've learned literally nothing about what they did in that situation. So that's the first thing that pops up in my head.
Yeah. I think another common thing is assuming that because it is a way in white cultures or white communities, it is the same way in other communities or cultures. Like, white hegemony is a very big thing. Just because this is the experience that you had around things growing up doesn't mean it's the experience everybody else had. And so, like, finding that humility around what the experiences have been, what the background has been, what the expectations are. Just because I know what the common stories are among white communities doesn't mean that I know what the common stories are among other communities. And just, opening up the floor for people to tell you, like, what their experiences were, what their assumptions were, what their narratives were.
I don't want to delve too deep into it because it's a story I'm already exhausted with. But recently, the whole situation with Will Smith at the Oscars. If you look at the discourse following what happened with Will Smith at the Oscars, you will see that, like, Black folks and white folks had very different responses to that situation, and like, there were so many people who were like, white folks who were like, I would press charges, I would do this, I would do that. And Black folks, whether they agreed with Will Smith or not, they never took it to that place of, here is something where there's a legal responsibility. Here's something where we want to call police about this situation. Regardless of whether they felt he was in the right or the wrong, we all felt it was more of an in-house situation that we need to handle versus something where we required an authority figure to come in and handle the situation for us, because these are very different cultural responses and very different trauma/defensive responses to the addition of police to any situation. So just piggybacking off after what Dr. Liz said, like, just understanding that your cultural experience might be very different than someone else's, and understanding that that's not a negative, that's not a value judgment, it's just a difference.
So we have a question in the chat. Do you have advice about being a part of or working with a multiracial polycule? So look, always look at lines of power and, like, who has power and over whom and with whom. How does the power get distributed? What are the unspoken rules? Like, where is the power existing that is not acknowledged? How do we bring attention to that? Like, who is accessing their autonomy, who is not? And, like, who gets to have space and what space do they get to take up? And that's, like, everybody I work with in every relationship they're in. That's a lot of what I'm looking at, is like, where does power run? Where does it come from? Who gets access to it? In what ways? In what ways is their access to their own empowerment limited?
Yeah, that's essentially what I was gonna say. And then, like, beyond that, letting people be who they are, letting people be themselves, without trying to sort of define what someone else's experiences are. Like, I'm Black. I'm gonna bring the Black with me wherever I go. If there is something that requires me to say, like, hey, here is a Black aspect of this that you are not realizing, I'm gonna bring that. I'm gonna bring it up. Whereas otherwise, just treat me like a person, because that's who I am. If there is something you're not spotting, let me pick up on that. there are times where, that.
Yeah, and I think too, like, part of that also is looking at, like, is it acknowledged and how is that playing out? I think sometimes there are ways that when we work with like multiracial relationships, we get like extra on top of it of like, is everybody talking about race here? Is it like, how is it going? How is it okay? Right? Where like the anxiety that we have about it can come into the therapeutic relationship. And I think giving people the space to like acknowledge and own what is coming up for them and what's not is really important.
Absolutely.
Probably have time for one more question before we do closing. Is it? Oh, here's one from Katie. Your thoughts or book
Decolonization, yeah. Has Sonalee written anything about decolonizing poly? I don't know.
The
There are some
closest we got
people.
is Love's Not Colorblind, and that's not really that book.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are people starting to talk about decolonizing polyamory, but I don't know that there's a lot of stuff written about it.
Yeah. Social
the
media
Critical
is a place for
Polyamorist
it.
blog looks like it's about Indigenous perspectives on polyamory. Yeah, I mean, decolonizing polyamory relationship anarchy. So it looks like, here, I'll put this link in here.
Like there's a lot on social media. Like there's a lot of polyamory follows on like Instagram or TikTok. Like there's literally I think it's either called Decolonizing Polyamory or Decolonizing Poly on TikTok. That is an account there. Polyamorous Black Girl on Instagram and TikTok does that. Polyamorous While Asian on Instagram. Like these are some follows for you, but like there aren't a lot of books and there aren't a lot of resources right now. Social media is the place to find these folks.
Yeah, you're gonna find a lot more stuff in like blogs. Oh, Dr. Kim Tallbear talks about this a lot too. Kim Tallbear talks a lot about, from an Indigenous lens, decolonizing sexuality a lot. Sonalee Rashdawar, I think, also talks about it. Oh yeah, here's a multi-amory episode with Dr. Kim Tallbear. Yeah. So there's a lot of, there are some people starting to talk about it more. It's less common. There's not a lot of written stuff about it. We could go into a whole thing about like the difficulties of publishing and all of that if you are of a minority community. Yeah.
Can
I
I
was just
say
happy to greenlight
one
Nazi
thing?
romances.
Yeah, I'd like to say just one quick thing. Hi, I'm Rami, and I'm with LifeWorks, and I'm just very pleased that the two of you are here tonight, and so many resources. I have to say, just personally, that I've been in a polyamorous relationship for about 40 years. And certainly when I got into my polyamorous relationship, there were no resources to turn to. I didn't know the word, so like we were just living that life. But now to see so much, and even when we started KPACT, there was almost nothing in the Chicago community in terms of therapists talking about this. So I just want to appreciate the work that you're doing, the work that everybody's doing, that people are here listening, participating. And basically I'm just really thrilled, and thank you very much.
Hey, thank you. Thank you so much for having us here.
Yeah.
All right, I'm noticing the time, so I'm just going to go ahead and wrap us up. But Dr. Liz and Kevin, I don't know if you're open to questions being emailed to you that anyone wants to know. But if you are, we just encourage people to put their email in the chat so people can grab that if they have more questions for you. So first, let's just take a moment to thank to Kevin and Dr. Liz for being here. If people want to come off mute and just give a clap for their
Hey, thank you so much.
hanging with us
Thank y'all
tonight.
so much.
Also, thanks to Anna at LifeWorks for connecting us with these great presenters. So that was really a great presentation. And I just have a few quick announcements from KPACT in general and LifeWorks. So please stay tuned.
I was gonna
Go
say,
ahead.
and I'm gonna I'm putting in the chat where anyone can reach me, and I encourage Dr. Liz to do the same.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you, guys. So, okay, so for KPACT this year, we have 2 more events coming up. We have an event in July with Dr. Michelle Vaughn, who's a licensed psychologist and associate professor who does her research and expertise on consensually non-monogamous people. And then in October, we're going to have Richard Sprott of Caris, and he's a prominent researcher on alternative sexualities. So please check out our website on KPACT to find out those events when we get the descriptions up. I also want to do a plug for LifeWorks of Practice. We are currently hiring therapists, and we're also actually hiring for a clinical director right now. So please go to the LifeWorks website if you're interested in either of those positions or know people who are interested. And then I also want to do a plug for one of our therapists who's here tonight. Antonia is hosting a queer mindfulness group at a sliding scale fee of $5 to $20. And it's Tuesdays.
Ren, hold on. Ren,
All right, I muted everyone. So there's a this group is on Tuesdays from 6 to 7, and you can register with us at LifeWorks. So please let us know if you're interested. And then finally, this is the survey link for the CEs. I'm going to put it here. I'm also going to email it out. You need to complete this within a week in order to get your CEs. So by next Friday, please complete this survey, and we will email you your CEs if you paid for CEs. If you didn't and you just want to give us feedback, we also would appreciate the feedback, and we will provide it to our presenters if there's stuff for them to share. So I think that's it. Does anyone else have any announcements before we close? I muted you if you thought you were unmuted. Okay. So now one more time, let's all come off, unmute ourselves and just say goodbye and thank you. And thanks for being here tonight. And yeah, so everyone come on off and just give your thanks and goodbyes.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for coming.
Welcome, everybody.
Hi,
everyone.
Very much.
So
Thank you.
wonderful
Good to meet you
to
all.
be here.
All right.
Rich 2 hours.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Liz, and thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.
Maybe Anna will reach back out to you guys so we can get some contact details for you, and we'll be in touch.
Right.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
I took
Have a good
I
evening.
took some notes on those resources, but if you do have something like that, you could email me that, or us, that would be also nice. But I took some notes, but there was so much happening. There was a lot of stuff you guys had. So if there is
Yeah.
anything you want to email, that'd be awesome.
Okay. Yeah, we can work on that for sure. And I
Beautiful.
just saved the chat, so I have it.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Awesome.
Okay,
Wonderful.
cool. Thanks so much
All
for
right.
being here. This was great.
Thank
Have a
you.
good weekend.
You as well.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
All right. Bye.
Good night.
Bye.